Hi, this is Ron Hetrick, Senior Labor Economist and Vice President of Staffing Products here at Emsi Burning Glass. Last April, we released an article called The Demographic Drought. During the year last year, we filmed a presentation showing how things had evolved since that time. And we're back again to talk once again about how this demographic drought actually started, and then to update you on the latest and greatest information around this particular topic. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the subject matter. To do this, we always want to look at this as if it's a story. It is a background, something that's going on for all of us, for all of our lifetimes. That background is going to help us understand that where we are in the present is really largely a result of things that were already unfolding that we may not have been aware of. If we then understand what's happened in the present, then as we look out into the future and want to know where are things going to go, we'll have a better understanding how it's all going to unfold going forward. And lastly, we're going to talk about what can you do during these times. Apologies in advance that these things that you can do, there's really not a whole lot of them. A lot of these things that we're going to talk about are things that do not have simple solutions, but we're going to go into those things anyway. So with that in mind, let's talk about the world as it existed prior to COVID. And now a lot of this is something that just you're not really aware of, or you weren't thinking about how it was impacting the labor force, but we really want to make sure we understand these things because it's going to help explain a lot of things later. So the primary thing that we want to focus on here is that the labor force itself grew tremendously in the early 70s. Why? Number one, because of the baby boomers. We had a lot more children. But it's not only just about having more children. When we're talking about the labor force, it's the fact that women were entering in earnest during this time. And in essence, between the childbirths and women entering, we almost doubled the size of our labor force. Now, if you think about it, we had an economy that was not used to having all of this labor. So everything starts to change when women come in. One thing is there's just a lot more people competing for jobs. So to stand out against all of those people, you need to do things. And one of those things, of course, is getting a college degree. So the amount of people out there getting college degrees was increasing. We also created all kinds of certifications. Anything that you could do, you had to do. You were competing against a lot of people. And that's what kind of makes the boomers special. In order to win a job, to keep a job, they had to drive themselves really, really hard. Now, when you drive yourself hard, and now you've got two people working in a household, also something we did not have prior, you end up greatly increasing household wealth. This is a really important factor when we get to later on in the slides, when we're talking about the boomers themselves. We need to understand something. They were very driven because they had to be in order to get a job, and then they made a lot of money. If we look at this slide, if we go to a 20-year period from 1955 to 1975, in real dollars, so we're taking into account inflation, household income only went up by $9,000. Now, when you go to the next 20-year period, and remember, boomer women entered the labor force in earnest in the early 1970s. So if we use that point, and then we go the next 20 years, the same 20-year period, household income goes up by $42,000. So two people earning money, both very driven. We had a tremendous increase in wealth. And now let's just store that for later, because this is going to come into play when we start to talk about where we are now. So this is the tsunami slide. This has been happening for all of our lives. Pretty much everybody who's going to be watching this is only going to have known one reality. And that was one where there was a massive surge of workers, all very driven, all with a number of skill sets. And we did a lot of things because of that. We created job descriptions. We got really picky with what we wanted because we could. And this wave was going through as we were experiencing that. The yuppies of the 80s, the 80-hour work weeks, these were all because of this population. But that population is retiring now. Now, there's a problem with that. First off, it created at the time prior to COVID. So let's go back to February of 2020. Our unemployment rate had hit an all-time low of 3.5%. Now, the important thing you have to understand here, 3.5% is a really, really low unemployment rate. And it basically means that we were consuming everybody that we had, almost everybody. So this was our first reality that we had back in February of 2020. We were consuming almost everybody. At the time, because we were consuming all of these people and these boomers were retiring, we had at the time a record 7 million job openings. And that was pretty astounding at that time. At that time, we only had 5.9 million unemployed people. So we had way fewer unemployed people than we had job openings at that time. Before COVID ever struck, before any of the things that you're feeling now, this was already our reality in February of 2020. Another factor is the first thing we're going to do is we got to blow up a myth. These boomers that worked really hard, a lot of people thought, well, they're just going to work forever. They love to work, so they're just going to keep on working. But actually the opposite was happening. As that number was increasing of people over 55, the number of people over 55 who are dropping out of the labor force but still looking for work was actually going down. What this tells us is that those boomers were retiring and staying out of the workforce. They were not interested in returning. One of the big explanations for that is because they had made so much money, they worked hard, and now they were going to enjoy those retirement years. So this was another thing that we were seeing, a large population that was becoming more disengaged. Now, as the boomers kind of dropped out and did not want to work anymore, the millennials then took over as our primary part of our working age population. So an important factor here, the boomers kind of go off onto the sunset, and then the millennials start taking over as our predominant labor force. But there's a problem with that. As the millennials entered in, which is at this point right here, this is kind of our Gen X years, then the millennials enter in, labor force participation starts to go down. So what this tells us is, as a percentage of the total, millennials were just working as a population less than the generations before them. And you can see this consistently working its way down until shortly before COVID, when we started to get a slight run-up. Now, looking at that run-up starts to unveil another really important factor. So if we look at what was causing the run-up, it's not men. Prime-age men were still going down, almost all the way till the end, a slight tick up, but mostly going down for reasons that we're going to talk about a little bit later. If you want a full explanation, read Demographic Drought. I go into it in great detail in that article. Really what was happening was women were starting to enter back into the labor force. This is also going to be an important factor when we talk about, well, what's happening now and why are we feeling some of the pain we're feeling? Well, part of it's because women were making up this return, and there's some issues now that's kind of keeping them from recovering to where they were at that time. So another factor, if we've already talked about boomers, hardworking, they've retired, they're not really looking to work. We know labor force participation was going down. Another issue that we were seeing was the people that were working were choosing to work part-time. We're a society, a modern society built on a 40-hour plus work week, yet more and more people were disengaging from the concept of a 40-hour work week. They were choosing to go part-time. Think about those kind of things when you look at things like part-time pay. Right now, you're seeing pay rates going through the stratosphere, for fast food jobs or retail jobs. These jobs were already being more and more attractive to people at that time, and now they're paying a lot more, which only makes that attraction, more compelling. Another population, if we go back into it, remember I was talking about men, labor force participation was starting to go down. But for the men that were in the labor force, more and more were choosing to work part-time. This is not choosing to work part-time, you have to. This is choosing to work part-time. That was going up. So more and more men were dropping out of the labor force or choosing instead to go work in a part-time capacity instead. So we can see that in this kind of convoluted table that's actually going to be easy to understand once I break down one particular point. So we're looking at paychecks. We're looking at paycheck data that comes out of ADP. And we're looking at the industry that somebody worked from, and then they quit and they went to go for another job. And this is the industry they went to. So let's go to manufacturing. This is the industry people quit. They left manufacturing. And if we look over here, about 30% of them were going to trade, retail, wholesale trade. Now, if we reverse it and go down to retail, wholesale trade and look to manufacturing, only 8% of people that left this industry were coming over here. So if we look, you also see this here, manufacturing going to hotels and restaurants, but hotels and restaurants not coming back to where manufacturing was. So more and more people we know were leaving these full-time jobs that so many employers want filled now to go part-time. So that's our background. Large boomer population, made a lot of money, retiring, people already less interested in working just as a trend, and then people saying, well, if I'm going to work part-time. If we take all of those things into account, then everything that happened with COVID could not have come at a worse time. So it's not just a perfect storm. As we say here, it's a hurricane, a tornado, and an earthquake rolled into one. So the first things first. Something that I really have barely had to update on my slide deck is our labor force participation rate is not recovering. So when we look at all of the pain that people are feeling right now, why are we in all this acute pain? The acute pain that we're feeling is this. So this is the percentage of our civilian population over the age of 16 that's in the labor force. So they either have a job or they're looking for a job. That participation rate plummeted started to recover and has flatlined for about 18 months. So we're not getting this number back. And you want to understand, well, what does that mean? How many people are we really talking about that have disengaged from the labor force and going out of the labor force? It's not going to come from the unemployed side. That one, we're almost back to where we were prior to COVID. This is our graph here that we want to focus on. These are the actual number of people that are out of the labor force. And you can see we were kind of rolling along, slowly growing. We get this huge spike. It starts to come down. And then, like I said, with labor force participation flattening, this also flattens. Well, this is about 5 million people. We're missing 5 million people that were in our labor force prior to COVID, and now they're gone. They're out of our labor force now, and that's causing, a lot of problems. Before we can kind of dig in farther, we have to start to understand, well, hey, okay, we're around 5 million people, but who's out of the labor force? And we can see that here. So if we want to go back, I want to go back to February of 2020. Even though things were really tight, let's at least get back to there. To get back to those numbers that we have to get about 621,000 still unemployed people off of unemployment back into jobs. If you look, this is a pretty small number. This is not our primary problem, as I already mentioned. Our problem is this. This is our out of the labor force excess population. Now, if we look at 20 to 24-year-olds, we see they're already back. In fact, they're back so much that they are actually above the levels that they were in February of 2020. So this is not our issue here. Now we start to run into our problems. We're missing 1.2 million prime age workers, 25 to 54-year-olds. This is excess out of the labor force. Okay, this is our first big chunk, but our biggest chunk is right here. So people 55 and above, 3.4 million of our total 5 million to get back to where we were in February 2020 is coming from this population, 55 plus. Now we've got a problem when we get to that. So first thing is, if all of those people are missing, then it's going to create more job openings because remember what I said, in February of 2020, we had a really low unemployment rate, which means we were consuming pretty much everyone that we had. And now I've showed you that we're missing 5 million people. So what happens is your job openings go from 7 million up to about 11 million. So this gap, this massive spike you're seeing are because we were consuming people who are now no longer even in the labor force, and it's creating all kinds of problems. So the question is, why are we not recovering faster? Why aren't people coming back? What is it that's keeping us from getting back to at least where we were in February 2020? And by the way, we should be beyond that number at this point, but let's at least try to get back to there. So let's see if we can figure out why. And the reasons for this are actually a number of reasons. It's not one reason. Don't let anybody ever tell you it's one reason. It's actually a combination of these. And some people, it may be 3 or 4 of these at one particular time. But we do have to understand that fixing one thing is not going to make everything go away because we have a lot of different reasons why we're just not recovering faster. So the very first reason that we're seeing is that we're really misaligned as an economy. We have a very false expectation of what we have. So it was a book written in the 2010s by a fellow named Hans Rosling called Factfulness. In that book, Hans Rosling would travel around the world talking to some of the most intelligent people he could find, CEOs of companies, college university professors, all kinds of people, and he would ask them a series of questions about the state of the world. How much of our world lives in poverty? What percentage? What percentage of our world can't read? What's the average birth rate of a woman in Africa? When he would ask these questions, no matter who he asked those questions to, they always answered with the way the world was in the 1960s. Certainly not the way the world was in the 2010s. People had a very dated view of the way the world was, how the world operated, what it looked like. And he's like, if you have that misunderstanding, if you have a false perception of the way that the world is, you're more likely to do policies and things that aren't going to be good for the way things are if you have that outdated view. Well, we have the same problem here. We have a vision of ourselves as a country of being kind of that blue-collar lunch pail nation. But let's look at this, because we're actually not that at all. This is our labor force above the age of 25. The blue represents people who have a college degree, either a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree or advanced skills training. So we look at that number and it's 97 million. Now, if we go over here, this is our population of people who only have a high school diploma or less. So if you're watching this video thinking about what you're trying to hire, There are so many companies out there trying to find this person over here. They're trying to find the person who does not have a college degree. In fact, increasingly, we're hearing of companies that used to require a college degree dropping the college degree requirement because they think it's going to open up their labor pool significantly. Once again, they have a false perception of who we are as an economy. They think this number is really, really large, but it's actually this number that's really large. We're a very educated nation. So here's the problem with that. If we look at our current job openings data, we have about 6.2 to 6.5 million openings that do not require a college degree. Retail, restaurants, hotels, manufacturing, construction, a lot of healthcare jobs, a lot of civic jobs do not require anything more than a high school diploma. So we have all of those openings, but we only have 2.1 million people who are unemployed, actively seeking work, who only have a high school diploma. So right here, just in these unskilled, semi-skilled, lower skilled jobs, we see way, way more job openings than we actually have people. The way I always say this is we have a service economy, but there's no one here to serve us in our service economy. Now you can see that we have this gap that exists at the top, but we've always had that gap. That gap's pretty consistent. We've always talked about a shortage of STEM workers, a shortage of certain higher degree people. That's going to be the norm. But what we don't understand is this is what's causing a lot of our pain. And this is actually something that is evolving and getting worse. So this is a pretty amazing slide to look at. If we look at the past 10 years at our country, and you go back 10 years, this is our population growth for people above the age of 55. That's going straight up. Now, our prime age working population, it was going up because of here, but those people then go into the 55 plus, then it starts to flatten, and now it's starting to go down a little bit. So our prime age population is starting to shrink. Here's our troubling part. These are the people that typically take those lower skilled jobs, people 20 to 24 years old. Those are the people you typically see in restaurants and retail establishments. Our population is declining. That number's going straight down. People above the age of 55 going up. Our prime age population kind of stuck going down. And then the people who are going to be replacing these people in the labor pool, they're going down. Significant problem that we're facing. Once again, this has been intensifying rapidly. If I only go back 7 years to 2015, we had 3 times as many lower skilled employees per job opening than we have now. So lower skilled unemployed people looking for a job, we had 3 times as many just 7 years ago than we have right now. That's how fast this problem has materialized for us. Now, one of the ways we've always mitigated this was through immigration. Immigration was, hey, if we're not going to have that population here, I showed you 20 and 24-year-olds going down, well, then we could use immigration to help plug that gap. But as you can see, our immigration numbers have also been plummeting in recent years. In fact, if we look at last year, it was pretty much catastrophic. 2020 was definitely on a downward turn, but in 2021, we pretty much shut the gates. So there's about 9 million people stuck in the visa process right now. They've been approved. This is according to the Cato Institute, but they can't get through the process. Once again, the people who man the facilities that process these people, they're also having problems finding workers and getting up to speed. But what it's doing is it's sharply reduced our amount of immigrants. So this is the other reason you're feeling this pain. A significant drop-off in our labor force participation rate, a shrinking younger population, and then the only other way that you can have that population, of course, is through this. And we're going to talk about this again in the next section. But just remember, this number's also declined sharply. So that's our first part, is we have this kind of massive gap of lower skilled workers. Now, the second part that we had was when we did this job loss, initially everybody kind of separated from their job. Now, historically speaking, during recessions, you have an overheating part of the economy, the housing market in the mid-2000s, the telecom equipment market in the early 2000s. Those sectors overheat and then they correct. And when you get a correction, you go through a recession. Now, people who work for those industries that are being corrected, they immediately look for other work. They are kind of panicked almost to say, they need to get back out and get a job. But with what happened with our COVID response was we felt that we were just going to tighten that hose and then we were going to release the hose again. So we told people, look, I don't want you to go out and find other jobs. We'll give you some assistance to bridge this gap. So we created some programs during that time to help people bridge that gap of we're telling you not to work, but we're going to want you to work again. So we created something called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA, and then Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC. Now, these programs at their peak had 18 to 20 million people receiving those checks. Even when that program ended in September 6th of last year, we were still cutting about 9 million checks. Now, that's not 9 million individuals because you could receive both of these, but understand we had record numbers of job openings at that time, and yet still a lot of people on the sidelines that were receiving pandemic aid to help them, like I say, bridge that gap. That's all part of a bigger thing called the CARES program, this CARES package. So when we look at the CARES package, it added about $4 trillion into our economy. About $2 trillion or less went straight into consumers' pockets to help them, once again, deal with this kind of interruption to their lives and not working. So we see that actually reflected here. If this money went to people, imagine these two graphs. So this is personal income, and this is personal savings rates. Now, I've started these graphs in 2019, but if I were to take these graphs and go out 50 years to the left, this number is relatively flat, just grows very, very slowly during this entire time. If I take personal savings rates and go out about 50 years, this number is flat for pretty much all of eternity. What we've never had happen was what happened here. When we started sending CARES Act payments out, all of these other forms of aid, we greatly increased the amount of income that people had. You start to get this huge bump up in personal income that was occurring during that time. Now, people largely must have not have needed or whatever was going on because they took that money at the same time and they threw it into their savings and they banked all of these. And you kind of see each time a check went out, you get these kind of blip ups where personal savings went up. Now, if we watch this, we can slowly see that people were eating away at this. Now, this is another reason why, as long as there were variants or people were afraid of mandates or anything, people could stay out because, look, it's always going to come down to one thing. If you're not working, we're going to assume that you have a means to eat. We're going to assume that you have a means to have a place to live. So if those needs are being met, and you have any kind of fear or hesitations, you can stay out of the labor force. But once those needs aren't met, then you're going to have to re-enter. It doesn't matter how afraid you are of things, you'll find a way to work again just to overcome those particular things. So that's one of the things we want to watch are, did people eat through that money? Are they ready to come back into the labor force? So we've been watching this thing kind of trailing off. It is back to our pre-pandemic levels, and we're hoping that that's a sign that maybe people will start to return. So that's the big question. Are they going to return? Now, we go back to that slide a long time ago when I said, we need to know exactly who's out of the labor force. And I said, who's out of that labor force predominantly are people above the age of 55. It was 3.4 million of just shy of 5 million total number. Now, of that group, we have a problem. A lot of those people retired. Now, remember what I said earlier, boomers made a lot of money. And when they retired. They weren't looking to come back in because they were going to bank that money. If we go back to 2020, when a lot of these people retired, stock market had a phenomenal year. So it was a great time to kind of jump ship and leave that labor force. And they did in earnest. In fact, NPR estimated that it was about 2 million excess. We've estimated about 1.5. I've seen as low as 1. Doesn't really matter. We know that it was over 1 million people that have excess, left the labor force, retired, and they're not coming back. You may hear of some people saying, well, I'm seeing, articles on people returning. Some people are unretiring. We're talking handfuls, but we're talking about millions potentially that left that labor force. We're not going to get those people back. Once again, they made a lot of money. Don't mistake their passion for earning at that time for the fact that they love to work. It's more of the fact that they had to do these kind of things, and then they accumulated their wealth, and they're using that right now. And if you're thinking, well, maybe they will come back, well, there's no hope for that as we see so far. This is our labor force participation rate for people above the age of 55. And as you can see, it went down, started to recover, and then this odd thing occurs. It goes back down again, and then it just gets stuck way down here. This is through vaccines. This is through all the other things, time going on. We see these people not at all interested in re-engaging. So they're showing us so far that the hope of that huge population that's separated is probably not coming back or coming back in earnest. Now, another part of this, something I talked about at the very beginning, we talked about labor force participation amongst prime age men. Well, there's a big, big problem occurring in that population, especially if we're talking, once again, about that population that only has a high school diploma or less. And that is opioid addiction. And big ones now is fentanyl overdoses. So from July of 20 to July 21, we set an all-time record of 100,000 overdose deaths, largely fentanyl. We also, through the research, there's about 800,000 prime age men that are estimated to be out of the labor force that are battling addiction. Those people would go a long way to filling a lot of these job openings that a lot of people feel pain in manufacturing, retail, restaurants, things like that. But they are out of the labor force. In a lot of cases, have actually passed away due to opioid addiction. This is a problem that just keeps getting worse and worse every single year, and something we just simply have to get addressed because it is definitely knocking out a key part of the population we really need to re-engage. So if this is all the case, let's take a look at something that's kind of now becoming really amazing. Back in May of 2021, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce went out and asked 9.3 million people who had originally lost their jobs due to the pandemic, are you coming back to work? Back in May of 21. At the time, 1.2 million said, nope, I'm never coming back to work. Now, these are probably those excess retirements. They're out for good. Not too surprising. Then we have this 1.6 million people who said, this is May of 21, I'm going to go back to work, but I'm not going back to work in 2021. I'm going to wait until 2022. They already knew at that time that they were not going to re-engage in the labor force until the next year. This is our problem right here as well. We had 3.5 million people at that time say, I'm going to go back to work, but they weren't definitive about when. I'm going to, maybe soon, I don't know. Well, if we look at how labor force participation went and we look at our labor force over the year, we can see that this didn't happen. Most of this 3.5 million stayed on the sidelines. They joined this 1.6 million and no, I'm not coming back. Apparently in 2021, we're going to wait until 2022. So at the time, only a third of those people were actually saying, yeah, I'm actually looking for a job. I've been applying. I'm out there. I'm unemployed, but I'm looking to find a job right now. Only a third in May of 21 were actually trying. The rest of these, from we can tell now in retrospect, did not go back during last year. So this gives us some thought or some hope about what we could be seeing this year is if these people were true to their word, then maybe we could see this group of people coming back this year at some point. But as of yet, we're still not seeing it. So this is something we want to keep our eyes on. Now, if they come back to work, understand that people do have an option of working for themselves. So this is self-incorporated. A lot of people ask me, well, do we count people who work for themselves in the numbers? And the answer is yes, as long as they're doing it legally. They've declared themselves as a self-incorporated person. They're declaring income to the IRS. Yes, they are counted in the payroll numbers. And it's something that employers have to always be mindful of is, we have generated a lot of wealth. We already saw personal income went spiking up. We saw savings went up. It's a prime opportunity for people to start their own business. And we do see that this number jumped up. Now, it's kind of mitigated in recent months, which is an encouraging sign, but it's always something we have to watch. As long as you see, rhetoric out there about vaccine mandates or companies, trying to do certain things, there's always going to be a certain percentage of the population that goes, you know what, I'm going to avoid that mandate by just working for myself. And so this is something that we're going to watch this number because, it's not going to help a lot of people watching this if people come back to work, but they work for themselves when you're trying to get them on your particular payrolls. So this is our whole thing. We talked about our background, what basically was leading up the whole way the world had changed and evolved to February of 2020 when things were already really bad. We just really weren't thinking about it as bad at that time. And then we looked at it and you can see that it just got so much worse, as due to the pandemic response, caused a lot of these things to really explode. So here we are going, okay, well, what does the future look like? So the first thing we want to establish is two things. One, there's a difference between population and labor force. So a population are the people, if you live in a certain location, you can increase your population either through A, having more babies, B, having people from elsewhere in the country move to your part of the country, or C, immigration, which we've already talked about. Now, just because you have an increasing population doesn't mean you have an increasing workforce. You could be attracting a lot of people who are retirees, for example, and they are not only maybe not working anymore, but they're actually putting more burden on the services that your local area can actually provide. So we need to make sure that we have a population that's in your area. Hopefully you're getting some of these through immigration or through migration. And then we need to get those people working. We got to get them off the sidelines. This is our problem. Once again, it's not our unemployed people that we're having a problem with. The problem is we have all these people who are dropping out of the labor force, and we have to get them working again. So this is the key thing that we're trying to solve is that part. So let's knock off the first one. It's not going to come from babies. We already know that. Since the early 1970s, we haven't been at a replacement birth rate. In fact, it's been getting worse, as we'll show in a second here. If we even go back to 2009 to 2019, This blue means replacement birth rate, 2.1 birth rate. We at least had a number of states that were in the blue in 2009. But by 2019, everybody's in the red. No one was having births to replace their population. And in 2020, we actually had the lowest birth rate in our entire history. So this is actually, as we're finding out more and more, it didn't just happen here. It happened to a number of developed nations. But this is another problem that we're having, is we're just not creating that kind of next generation of workers. In fact, we can see it here. In the decade of 2010 to 2020, we had our lowest population increase since the decade after the Great Depression. Now, in that decade, a lot of people weren't having babies because they didn't know if they'd be able to feed them. So we're talking about a totally different dynamic here. This is just literally just not having children at this time. And if you want to see this, this is really cool. Like, you can actually see how this goes in over time. So this graph is the actual number of people in our population by each year. So the top line is the number of people in our population that are 22 years old. And as we go down, we're going to work through each year down to the bottom, which is the number of people in our population less than a year old. Now, as you can see, outside of every now and then we get this thing goes out, for the most part, this is going inward, which means we're going to have less and less every single year. We're going to have less and less people hitting 18 and entering that workforce, or 16 and entering the workforce. So this is a significant problem. Birth rates alone that's only going to get worse. The problems that we're feeling now are only going to get worse. So this is something where we make these kind of small on purpose just so you can illustrate it. If we go and we look at the past 10 years, now I've already talked about this earlier, this is the population in our country. If you see something in blue, it means in the past 10 years, in this top one, that the population of people over 65 grew in these areas. So you see that pretty much the whole map is either flat, it's pretty much the same. You see a lot of blue on there, just a few times when it's not. So this shows us that in the past 10 years, most parts of the country either saw their over 65 population increase or just hold the same. Now here's the bad news. On the bottom, if this graph is red, it means that in the past 10 years, your population under 25, in other words, your emerging workforce, the ones who are going to come into the labor force, if you're in the red, it means you've lost that population. So it's not even about labor force right now. We're talking about literal population. If you're in red, you've lost the population of people under the age of 25, so the people coming in. Now, if you're in blue here, that's really not because of birth rates. We already said that number is getting smaller every particular year. That's probably coming from moves. So this is actually, we can see this here. So a lot of the country is called the funnel effect. The Northeast kind of drains down to Florida or Georgia. The Midwest seems to be draining into Texas. And then the West Coast kind of drains into Arizona. So you have the southern part of the United States, which has absolutely exploded in growth in the past year. And then you see the sacrifices coming really from the other regions. So, we already talked about birth rates are a problem and they're going down. The second part we talked about was you have to have people moving to your area. If you're an employer in an area that's getting the double whammy of less births and everybody's moving away, you're really feeling that pain. But if you're in an area where they're moving to, then that can give you some level of hope. And you can kind of see the individual states, who's growing the most and then who's kind of hemorrhaging workers the most. So another thing we have to be mindful of is your area, is your state able to grow its population at a time that we really need that population to be going up? So if that's happening, if our younger population, as we just showed over and over, is getting smaller, then it means things like college enrollment, that's going down. And a lot of colleges and universities are already feeling this. We know enrollments in the past year were very, very low. It's leading to higher acceptance rates. And this is only something we got to keep our eyes on going forward. That's only going to intensify. Additionally, we have, over time, we're going to see much greater percentage of our population getting above working age and a smaller population supporting them. By 2034, we will have more people over the age of 65 than we have children for the first time in history. So it's just us as a nation, how eminent we are to being very top heavy. A lot of people out of the labor force needing to be supported by a population that's simply not there. Not there, not replacing. So these are things that we've got to, as a country, start addressing. But it's not just us. It's actually pretty much every developed nation in the world. If we look at birth rates around the world, they've been plummeting for a long time. So this line here is the world's birth rate, and you can see it's coming down to just above replacement level. Now, all the developed nations are all underneath this number. Korea, Italy, Japan, incredibly low. China had their lowest birth rate ever last year. Marriage rates are down dramatically in China. This is something that all of us are kind of battling, is the decreasing birth rates. Even a lot of the nations that we've depended on for labor in the past, and this is another important issue. If we're going to be a country on immigration, if we're not going to have our children ourselves, then we're going to need other people's children from other countries to come to us. However, birth rates around the world, even in the poorest of African nations, have also been coming down sharply. So this is something that, as a globe phenomenon, we will see this population inverting in time, something we talk about in demographic drought. So if this is our situation, there are going to be less people. We are seeing this huge departure occurring from baby boomers. We know that the population coming in is not big enough to replace that population. So if that's the case, everything that we did while the boomers were here, remember that was a lot of people, and we weren't used to having that many workers. So we did things to kind of help sort those people out, to weed them out, so that we didn't get bombarded with applicants when we had a job opening. We've got to start to undo all of that. So now it's going to be less and less about demanding everything you want and saying, what are the very few essentials that I absolutely need? Because I want to open my funnel to everybody I possibly can. As many people as I can see, I want to see them. So that's the first thing. We have to change our paradigm. Now, if we're going to do that, if we're going to basically look, I'm going to put up a job description, but I'm barely going to have anything in it as I must have. A lot of these are going to be nice to haves. Well, then you're going to have to get really good at onboarding and training. For years, we gutted our training departments because we had a boomer workforce, highly skilled, very competitive. We called it a ready-made workforce. These people had everything, and you could just go to the shelf and pick off what you wanted. Those people aren't here anymore. So you're going to have to start to pick up the burden on yourself. Get excellent at getting people in quickly, training them up to be competent in the jobs that you need them to do. The next part of this is that we're talking permanence here, right? We're not talking about something that's just going to go away. Even if the acute pain that we're in now eases, hopefully you understand that this problem that we have is never going away. So if that's the case, we've got to start to make this type of planning something that we're not looking at just for HR departments, just yelling at our HR people. Why are we not seeing applicants? This has got to make it to the boardroom. The CEOs have to be concerned about this. We've got to get workforce planning at a much higher level. People need to start thinking about it in terms of just like they would with their products they're selling or anything else that they're doing as an organization. The next part of that is partnering, which I'm going to talk about on this next slide. So this was an article that was written, came out of Harvard Business School, called Hidden Workers. This is yet another option for some employers, not all. And I understand that not everybody can do every one of these things. In fact, the article says don't. Pick a population. But these are populations that typically don't get jobs. So these are the populations that a lot of people, when they put out job postings, they're weeding these people out. But this is a sizable population. One of these populations are ex-offenders, so people who are already in prison. There are institutions in every single state that are committed to getting these people to work. And there are a lot of people that are qualified and can do the work. If you're willing to try that route, there are places that will work with you in that state to help transition these people from that prison setting into your particular industry. Now, if you want to do that, once again, we recommend go all in. Don't do one. Make that a strategy. Make that something you do, or you're going to go broke if you try to go after all of these things. If you're going to go after people with physical disabilities, then you don't want to convert an office for one person. If you're going to convert an office, then make it a thing. Try to get as many as you can. Work with those people, those advocates in your community, to get those populations to come to you. But this is one way that you can maybe tap into untapped talent that people that are out there. And when you do that, one of the things, the side effects of this is you can get more loyalty. Right now, we're experiencing this great resignation. People are not exactly loyal right now because pay rates are going up so dramatically that they're taking advantage of their opportunity. So as much as you can find people who aren't being able to take advantage of those opportunities, they might increase their loyalty to you. But you're going to have to do something different. You're going to have to do things that you never thought you were going to do. You may be pandering a lot more than you thought you were going to do, but you're going to have to get creative, understand that these things aren't going away, and plan for the future. And hopefully it'll be less painful if we do so. But thank you for your time. Once again, I'm Ron Hetrick, Senior Labor Economist and Vice President of Staffing Product Solution here at Emsi Burning Glass.